students of Knox County. My name is Riley Scheider. I'm an 8th grade social studies teacher in Excel Academy at Northwest Middle School. And today I'm going to be leading our talk on Andrew Jackson. I'm going to encourage you to have the 8th grade social studies work out in front of you while we talk about this, because there's going to be a lot of helpful information in there. Jackson is a really dynamic character. In fact, you can just see from our bottom list, he was an orphan, he was a famed military general and a champion of the common man. He's a president, and he's somebody who's like really divided in American history as far as how people view him, because some people think the things he did were awesome and some people think they were bad. And I'm going to try and create an argument for you to decide that today. But for us, we need to know that we're focusing on 3 separate standards. The Jacksonian era is actually its own module. I'm going to break down the 4 main things that we're going to focus on today. You should leave this lesson being able to understand Jacksonian democracy and what the spoils system is. You need to leave knowing that Andrew Jackson opposed the national bank specifically because he wanted to give more power to the states. You're going to understand what the Nullification Crisis is and how the Nullification Crisis is connected to federal versus state power. And then you're going to understand how Andrew Jackson is involved in the removal of the Cherokee people from the Southeast. So those are our big 4 goals to understand. But before we can get there, we kind of want to understand some context of just who is this person, because you might have heard his name in module 4 or 5. Like Andrew Jackson's name has come up for a little bit, but we need to understand a little bit about the person before we try anything else. So let's get rolling into that. So first, let's understand just who he is. So Andrew Jackson was born in South Carolina. Died right before he was born, and he was raised just by his mother. His mom is actually going to die by, you're going to see, the age 14. So she dies when he is very young. He actually grows up but there's something really impactful that happens in his childhood that we're going to kind of focus on, because it characterized just something very Andrew Jackson, if you want to say. One thing that happens is he actually joins the 13 colonies and fights against the British during the Revolutionary War and gets taken prisoner, him and his brother. The British officer, and you can see this in the picture, while he's imprisoned, commands Andrew Jackson, the boy, to shine his boots. And Andrew Jackson, a stubborn person, as we're going to come to find out, refuses and starts arguing, saying, "No, I refuse to do that." And this officer pulls out his sword and slashes Andrew Jackson across the face, and he actually bears that scar for the rest of his life. A man that every time he is looked at, he bears the scar of him refusing to do what somebody else told him to do. I think that's kind of powerful when we look at the person we're going to learn Andrew Jackson becomes. He is strong-willed from a very young age. So us understanding first that pain, and then second him becoming an orphan at the age of 14, it kind of sets us on a trajectory where we see that Andrew Jackson is going to be a really strong-willed person. At the age of 17, he decides to move to North Carolina from Charleston. Heard of Andrew Jackson before this is he was a really famous general. Specifically, he was a famous general in the Creek War, which was a war with Native Americans who lived in Alabama and Georgia, modern-day Alabama and Georgia. And he becomes famous by winning the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and this is a painting of that battle. He also is a famous War of 1812 general and actually becomes the most famous soldier from that war, the War of 1812 between the British and the Americans. And he's specifically famous for the Battle of New Orleans, which was this battle that protected the Mississippi River from the British to the United States, because if you control New Orleans, you control the Mississippi, which was a major trade route for the United States. So this kind of elevates him, Old Hickory, his nickname, to heroic status. Like he's compared to George Washington, where in the Revolutionary War you had George Washington, in the War of 1812 you had Andrew Jackson. And so when we think about war heroes, like his name comes up in conversation, and that heroic status is part of the reason he gets pushed to run for president in 1824, which is where we're going next. So this is just a quote from Andrew Jackson, like where we're setting this theme of like his life and his patterns. And we're trying to understand, okay, this person of Andrew Jackson. We know he's strong-willed, and now we're going to know he's even more stubborn when I was born for a storm and a calm does not suit me. That's one of his most famous quotes, where we kind of see that like Andrew Jackson like knows he is a controversial figure. He's born for a storm. Calms don't suit him. Like he is not somebody who is afraid to hide behind his opinion. He's born for the storm. So in the election of 1984, we're going to see very clearly Andrew Jackson receives the most, compared to John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William H. Crawford, receives the most electoral college vote, and he receives the most popular votes. A popular vote is individual people. But he doesn't receive a majority, and this is a key word, because in order to win, you have to receive over 50% of the electoral college vote. So there's actually written into the 12th Amendment, there's this phrase. So I actually have it on the slides. It says, the 12th Amendment was passed in 1803. It states that each elector, one of those numbers, must choose a candidate for president and vice president separately. It also states that if no candidate for president receives a majority, over 50% of electoral votes, then the House of Representatives actually chooses who becomes president next. So let's pause and think about that real quick. Translated, that means if no one candidate gets over 50% of the electoral college vote, pretty clearly from the numbers that Andrew Jackson doesn't receive over 50% of that vote. So he's not going to, in a situation known as the corrupt bargain. Now, you guys might have heard the word corrupt, like if you have a scab, it's corruption, or something's infected or gross. The corrupt bargain is when the House of Representatives votes, Andrew Jackson doesn't win, John Quincy Adams does. And so let's like kind of pause and think about that, because Quincy Adams achieves over 50%, so he clearly wins and becomes the 6th president of the United States. But I want to ask you guys, what would you do if you received the most amount of votes in an election and then in a revote you lost it? So you got the most votes to become president, and then you got told, nope, because of this loophole, you're not going to be president. And in the revote, you lost. Like, there's a little emotions chart over here. I'm just asking you, like, how would you feel? Like, happy, sad, angry, hungry, proud, shy, guilty? And my question is then, how would you spend your next 4 years? Well, I can tell you for Andrew Jackson, he was angry. He was ticked. And he is going to spend the next 4 years like really decisively acting against John Quincy Adams, because he wants to become president 4 years later in the next term in 1828. So how does he spend his next 4 years? He forms the Democratic Party. And so he forms this party on the belief that a small federal government should have power and give most of the power back to the states. Because he believed, Andrew Jackson, in representing this person that he labeled, and Thomas Jefferson labeled consequently, the common man, or the everyday person. And the everyday person in America, this person, or the most basic kind of person, would be a farmer or a factory worker. Just somebody who wasn't educated, was just trying to get their paycheck and take care of their family. A farmer or a factory worker. Andrew Jackson really wanted to appeal to that kind of person because those were his people. He was a common man. And so he becomes really popular in the South because, as we recognize, he becomes so popular because Clay's American system in the North didn't really benefit people in the South. The American system was the building of trains, highways, and increased trade. That really didn't help people in the South. It helped all the people in factories in the North make more money, the factory owners. And so Jackson really, really tries to solidify his base of people in the South because he's from the South too. He also spends the next 4 years criticizing everything John Quincy Adams does and labels him an autocrat. So an autocrat is somebody who is just like rich and kind of a more elite class of person. And he tries to do this because Andrew Jackson, again, represents the common man. And if he represents the common man, the more he can make it that look like a rich person doesn't understand the problems of common people, like he does with John Quincy Adams, then they're not going to vote for him. They're going to vote for Andrew Jackson. In the next election, 4 years later, Andrew Jackson comes in a blazing, and I want you to notice he gets his votes from the South and he gets his votes, some from New York, factory workers in New York. It's one of the main hubs. So he gets his votes mostly from his base, people where he represented the common man. So he wins this election over 50% of the popular vote, 68% of the electoral college vote, and he becomes the 7th president of the United States. Now, our first thing we said we were going to talk about was Jacksonian democracy and the spoils system. Okay, now what is the spoils system? Okay, the spoils system is this idea that when a president comes into office, they reward their supporters with government jobs. Basically meaning Jackson comes into office and he fires about 20% of the people who work for the government and replaces them with people who supported, agreed with, and voted for him. Now, that doesn't sound that outrageous. It's like, okay, well, it's probably easier to like work with people who you agree with. Like, for sure, that's a huge part of it. But Andrew Jackson like did this for like implemented this practice of the spoil system for like a really specific set of reasons. So the first reason was he believed that the government was corrupt if people never left their jobs. He thought that the government would be corrupt if everybody was able to always stay in their same job, and the government couldn't truly work for and represent all its people equally. That's part of the reason he fired people. He also established this mentality that was to the victor be the spoils, and you'll actually see that in small over here in this political cartoon. And it was this idea that, okay, well, you get rid of fraud and bribery and plunder if you eliminate the people who are in government causing those problems. And it's easier to run the government with people who support you. And so this is really a common practice of the presidency, but Andrew Jackson is the first person to do it, like people giving jobs to their supporters. That is just a norm in government now, but Andrew Jackson was the first president to really take that step and implement it. So as we look at what Jacksonian democracy was, and this is going to be a pattern that we notice, he worked in every decision he wanted to reduce or shrink federal power and give that power to the states. And in every action he's going to do, specifically in our next one, you're going to see that he does that. So a way that Andrew Jackson tries to give power to the states is he opposes a national bank. So why does he oppose a national bank, and what is it? When George Washington and Alexander Hamilton were first, like our founding fathers were first setting up the country, they believed that it was good for the country to have debt or credit because it made it easier to trade. And so this trade made interacting with other countries more realistic on an economic sense, because you could go into debt, you could offer loans, you could support businesses that were going to make your country money in the long run. But Andrew Jackson believed that whole system was just unconstitutional. He said in the Constitution, it doesn't create a bank, so I don't think a bank should exist. That's pretty much where Andrew Jackson landed. And he also hated the idea of debt in general. He believed it only supported the North, because Northerners who were building factories and trying to create these businesses were going to be able to take advantage of loans, whereas Southerners weren't. And Southerners were just inheriting a national debt in Jackson's mind that they were never going to gain anything from. So he believed it was morally wrong. It was actually like a failing of the country to have a national debt. And so he tried to eliminate the national debt, the national banks, so he could give that banking power to the states. He tried to take away the one and break it up into many. So how did he do this? The first thing he did was he vetoed the rechartering of the national bank. He basically said, oh, the national bank is up for renewal. And he said, nope, I'm not going to sign that. I actually veto it. This national bank will no longer continue to exist while I am president. And he also, anytime something came onto his desk, like a bill or a legislation, maybe for building roads or canals or trains, railroads, he vetoed those spending bills because he thought it was wrong to put the country in debt, and the country would function better if it was making money rather than owing money. The second thing he did was he thought it was a moral failing for the country to be in debt. We said it was morally wrong, and he hated paper money, and he wanted the United States to shift to coin money. Now, ultimately, your perspective on the bank can change, or the idea of having a national bank, but it ultimately didn't work out well for the United States. Like, there's no argument there. It caused the panic of 1837, where so many states were irresponsibly borrowing, or people were irresponsibly borrowing, and businesses were irresponsibly borrowing because these state banks didn't know how to function very well, that it actually caused a worldwide and economic depression. Because the United States economy started to fail and it couldn't trade, it caused the whole country to literally, you can see on the chart, go down, meaning that people were poor, caused a national depression. Like, it is what it is. Similar to the Great Depression. Why did he oppose the national bank? The first reason he opposed it was because he wanted to give more equal opportunities to Southerners, the people he represented, the people who voted for him. He wanted to make sure that those that he represented had a voice in government. And he felt like he couldn't do that if he couldn't respect the votes that he had gotten by the common man Southerners if the national government was in all this debt. So he tried to give the power to the states. Next thing, Andrew Jackson was responsible for the Nullification Crisis. Now, this is an important issue that we need to recognize, because it has 4 real phases. And in order to understand these phases, you kind of need to know all 4 are going to happen. So I'm going to talk about it real quick, and then I'm going to go specifically into all of them. So first, he created the Tariff Act of 1828, which created a tax on imported goods. An imported good is a good that comes in from another country to the United States. So he created a tax on goods coming into the United States. Then South Carolina said, I don't want to pay for that tax. Andrew Jackson says in phase 3, you have to pay for that tax. And then they argue about it for a while and come to a compromise of, okay, we're going to pay for the tax, but not as much as you originally promised. But let's see why that happened. So first, Andrew Jackson and the U.S. federal government passed the tariff of 1828 because he wanted to protect northern manufacturing. All of these common man factory workers in New York were going to get laid off if their goods weren't being purchased from factories. If businesses weren't growing, they couldn't run factories. Those people would go hungry. Those people wouldn't have work. And all the Southerners were ordering goods or buying their products from Europe because it was cheaper. So Andrew Jackson said, well, let's find a way for goods in the North to be bought in the South because they're cheaper than the ones in Europe. So he created an import tax. A problem, though, was it made goods more expensive for Southerners. And Southerners were like, well, we don't want to pay more money just because we have to. Like, Southerners were getting their goods from Europe, but they couldn't do that after this tax, and it ticked them off. Jackson wanted to protect the North and the northern factory worker, but the problem was South Carolina then says, going back, South Carolina says, we're going to refuse to pay the tariff. The national government introduces this tariff, and we're going to refuse to pay it. So Jackson is left in this spot of, okay, well, South Carolina doesn't pay this tax. If one state doesn't pay this tax, other states are probably not going to pay the tax. And if they don't pay the tax, they're going to just be ignoring the national government. We can't allow South Carolina to nullify or void or say they're not going to pay taxes, because then they're ignoring the national government, which is a key principle in federalism. You can't have the state governments ignoring the more powerful national governments. So Jackson gets something passed called the Force Act by Congress, which means he can actually force state of South Carolina to have to pay this tax. And there's this nullification crisis, this tension of South Carolina says they're not going to do it. Andrew Jackson says they have to. And they actually work out a compromise eventually where those taxes get paid, but at a much lower rate that reduces over 9 years. Now, the nullification crisis looking forward is really important because it's an example of when the South tries to ignore presidential authority or tries to ignore national mandates, which you're going to see close to the Civil War, specifically from South Carolina again. Now, I want you guys to take a moment and I want you to pause and look at this political cartoon. You're actually going to answer this question on your sheet that you got, but I want you to try and analyze, like, what is Andrew Jackson holding? What is he standing on? Where is he? How is he dressed? What words are around the screen? And I'm going to post a response to that later in the week. Next week when you get your work, that response will be there with kind of some things that you needed to notice from this. But as we start to see Andrew Jackson be more authoritative with the federal government, you're starting to notice this patterns of how he might be or why he might be portrayed a certain way in this picture. So I encourage you to answer that question carefully on your sheet. It's number 7. Fourth thing we need to learn about Andrew Jackson and we need to focus on is how he relates to the Indian Removal Act. Now, again, this is something that there are these 4 phases. So you have these settlers who have increasingly since the 1600s, like settlers have been showing up in America or been moving west into American Indian lands since as long as we have been studying in this class this year, ever since Jamestown. But the problem is that's Indians' land. Like Indians, settlers moving onto their land, they naturally attack to protect it, and settlers are attacking back thinking that they can just take the land. Now, the actual 2 groups of people fighting can be understood, but legally, that land was the American Indians. So Andrew Jackson has to, as president, be thinking of ways to try and remove American Indians from their land because settlers keep invading and trying to take that land for themselves. And it actually works its way up and is challenged in court until eventually Jackson orchestrates the forcible removing of those Native American peoples. So let's kind of go into the specifics of this. If you're Andrew Jackson as president, you have a responsibility to try and protect American settlers. You have this responsibility of like, okay, well, Americans are being attacked. Even if they're moving on American Indian land, they are being attacked. And I probably have a responsibility as president to do something about that. Also, as president, he has the action to try and always be acting in the best interest of America. So like he has the responsibility to try and be thinking, how could, like in this picture, how could I be taking this land, or how could I be expanding America west? Because that was constantly something early American presidents were thinking of. So these settlers were in fear of attacks, though, as they moved west. So he had a responsibility to think about that. Now, historically, that he does not have a good history with Native Americans. There's rumors of him being kidnapped by American Indians when he was younger. We also have historical documents talking about how he treated, while he was a U.S. general, Creek Indians, and his brutal known treatment then. Now, what did Jackson believe about it? He believed that the best way to solve the American Indian problem, as he said it, was to relocate the Indians west of the Mississippi River into what would be modern-day Oklahoma. So he noticed that settlers in Georgia and Tennessee and the Carolinas didn't really care about how much the Cherokee were adapting to fit into American culture. They cared mostly about just taking land and accessing that land for themselves. So Andrew Jackson, is integral in passing the Indian Removal Act, which is a law saying and encouraging all Indians to move west in the Mississippi. Now, this actually gets challenged in court in a decision in the Supreme Court, Worcester versus Georgia, and there are 4 main players. There's the Supreme Court, Andrew Jackson, Cherokee Nation, and American settlers. So we already talked about American settlers are trying to take land that belongs to the Cherokee, which is this yellow territory right here. You'll see Knoxville was originally Cherokee land. You have American settlers. You have the Cherokee Nation fighting to keep their land rights, which they actually have treaties from previous presidents, including George Washington, of documents saying that this is our land. This is land that is ours. You can't, like, settlers can't come and take this. You have Andrew Jackson trying to move America west and create opportunities for settlers to have new settlements so that they can make money and prosper. But then you also have the Supreme Court worried about American legitimacy in their treaties dealings. So you have all these players, but here's ultimately what happens. The Supreme Court sides with the Cherokee. It's with saying their treaties are legit and settlers can't be moving onto Cherokee land and taking their land from them. That is against the law. And that's actually when Andrew Jackson says this: the courts have made their rulings, now let them enforce it. He says, Supreme Court, if you're going to tell Americans they can't move onto that land, then you're going to have to be able to stop them, because I, as president, even though I have the authority to, am not going to do it. This is one of those things that kind of has a checkered past for Andrew Jackson, because like he has a responsibility as the executive to enforce the law. Supreme Court, they interpret the law. Executive, they enforce the law. Legislative branch, they make laws. So he has a responsibility to do that, and he actively chooses not to. In fact, after he leaves office, he had kind of helped orchestrate this thing known as the Trail of Tears. It happens while Martin Van Buren is president. But he orchestrates this Trail of Tears, which is the forced removal of natives from land, specifically the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Seminoles down in Florida. It's the forced removal of them from their land all the way into what would be now modern-day Oklahoma. So you can see visuals, and I would see that men, women, and children, as well as their animals and all their possessions, were forcibly marched on this trail. Now, they were forcibly marched by the United States Army. So the U.S. Army actually was sent to carry out these orders to forcibly remove these people from their land. Now, there's a lot of reading and studying that goes into this, and our focus is not necessarily on the Trail of Tears today. Our focus is on Andrew Jackson's role in the Indian Removal Act. But it would be wrong of us to not acknowledge that the patterns that Andrew Jackson set up, pushing for the Indian Removal Act, ultimately did lead to the trajectory of the Trail of Tears that did happen in the United States in history. So all of that to say, we have an assignment that you guys have gotten. So you guys have a title page, then you have 2 pages of reading, and then you have a last page that has reading comprehension questions that you see on my screen, page 3. And then you also have at the bottom of page 3 an engage activity. So questions 1 through 7 in your reading comprehension questions. All of those, I believe that information is accessible in your reading that you have provided. So they're not identification questions where you can just read it and automatically find the answer. They're questions that they make you critically think about, why would Andrew Jackson do what he is doing? And next week when you guys pick up your work, I'm going to actually have an answer key that I've provided for those questions for you. I'm going to encourage you to read carefully, annotate, and then try and answer these questions and think about why Andrew Jackson has made the decisions that he made and how those decisions impacted on a separate sheet of paper. Then you're going to do an engage activity, because Andrew Jackson has actually been in the news lately. A way he's been in the news is there's been a thought that maybe Andrew Jackson shouldn't be on the $20 bill. People are saying we should have different people on our money, and that's whoever is on our money represents our country. And that's an argument some people make. And so I attached at the bottom of page 3 an engage article, which is an article arguing Harriet Tubman would be put on the $20 bill instead of Andrew Jackson. Now, something to kind of think about. Harriet Tubman was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She was an abolitionist, and she was somebody who helped slaves escape from the South. And so she has some recognition in American history as well, but you have the ability to make a decision. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do, and these directions are actually on your instruction page. I want you to decide and make an argument. Who do you believe should be on the $20 bill? Andrew Jackson or Harriet Tubman? So on your direction, this in front of you. It's on page 1 of your documents that you were given. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is draw this chart. And on the left, I want you to put 3 reasons that you believe Harriet Tubman should be on the $20 bill based on the article and your knowledge of U.S. history. On the right, I want you to say 3 reasons that you believe Andrew Jackson should be on the $20 bill based on your knowledge and the resources you had provided and maybe this video. And then the last thing I want you to do is respond with an opinion of, okay, if you believe that Harriet Tubman or Andrew Jackson should be on the $20 bill, explain why and cite your evidence from your list. So don't just write down, oh, I believe this. I believe Harriet Tubman should be on the $20 bill. I believe Andrew Jackson should be on the $20 bill. Explain your reasons why. Maybe talk to your parents about it. Maybe talk to one of your siblings. Maybe FaceTime a friend and do it. But this is a real thing happening in our culture. So I think that's a really good way for you to engage and kind of wrestle with the person of Andrew Jackson. And again, he was a really famous leader, seventh president of the United States. And that's our lesson for today. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot. I certainly did. And thanks.